Hello, everyone. You're muted, Zach.
There was a moving truck in the background, and I muted myself in preparation just in case anybody could hear. And then I started the intro, and I had not unmuted myself. As I was saying, I'm Zach, and this is
I'm Gavin.
Vanguard live stream. You're Gavin.
Indeed. We're super excited to sanction this debate today. Again, it is debate day. Welcome to the live stream. Welcome to the Vanguard. If you're new, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're going to be doing more of these debates on a probably monthly basis going forward. So again, make sure to smash that subscribe and notification button so you don't miss the next one. Also hit that like button to promote this video in the algorithm so more people are privy to this exchange of ideas. And I think that right now is the perfect time to have this debate. It's actually a debate or a discussion that we've been wanting to sanction on our channel for a while now, but the recent, shootings across the country have really placed this issue back in the mainstream debate. And, once again, the country is kind of embroiled in this discussion with lots of people on both sides of the aisle making impassioned cases for their position. And while many people do have very passionate opinions on this subject matter, I think there's also a lot of us that fall somewhere in the middle that feel very torn maybe on these issues and feel that, maybe different areas have different, standards and all that. And we just figured it would be productive and a really good idea to have a discussion with two people that we really respect, two voices that we really like here at the Vanguard, and kind of just try to get to the bottom of this, because ultimately what we want to do here is try to find, or at least begin to try to find an answer to this problem, because I think everyone can agree it is, a problem. The mass shootings, the gun violence, whether or not, everyone has a different solution, and we hope to try to gauge and find some common ground, hopefully, or at least get to the bottom of and clarify some positions on the issue.
Yeah, and as always here at the Vanguard, what we're committed to with these debates isn't fireworks shows and a ruckus. What we're really interested in doing is just honing out our disagreements, and obviously in this case, Gavin and I will be playing the neutral moderators. But we want to get to the bottom of two different opinions on these issues and foster a conversation, right? There's no reason that we should hide from our differences of opinions when we have them. In fact, we should do the opposite, right? We should lay them out and kind of go over them together. And I think that's what we're in for today, which is why we're really excited to bring both these guests on.
Absolutely. So without further ado, we'll be introducing our two participants in this debate. And again, one of them will be defending the more robust Second Amendment stands, defending gun ownership, and the other will be making more of a case for gun reform. So again, without further ado, we can add on Mr. Steve Cox, Congressional Candidate, California, Independent. He will be defending a robust Second Amendment, defending gun ownership. And Mr. Ben Burgis, Jacobin contributor, philosophy instructor, has a show on YouTube as well. Everyone check it out. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us here in the Vanguard. We're really pleased to be in your presence and to have this discussion today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us both.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, same here. Thanks, and nice to meet you virtually, Ben.
Nice to meet you, Steve.
All right. Well, Gavin just disappeared for a moment, so it's good that we can start this debate with at least one technical difficulty. I imagine he'll be back here in a second. But I guess if one of the things that we wanted to do just briefly is if you could both introduce yourself and your position really quickly on the podcast. And Steve, if you'd like to go ahead and get started for us.
Me? Okay. My position is that we as a society and especially within our government, we tend to ignore root causes. We tend to ignore the disease, and we tend to want to concentrate on the symptoms, right? And I think that that's sort of by design. I think over the course of time, what's happened is the Democrats and the Republicans, but the two major parties, but it's just Democrats happen on this issue to be the anti-gun side or whatever. They both use tragedies. They both use awful events and things like that to try and bolster support, right? So everything that's bad that they can use in campaigning, our immigration policy, guns, wars, et cetera, all these things where there are wedge issues, essentially where there are two sides to it that people, take one or the other. The politicians like to take whatever side is going to polarize people for themselves and against the other side so that they can campaign on, look at what I can do and look at what they can't or won't do. And, working on those the symptoms doesn't fix anything. If you want to actually fix stuff, you got to go to the roots. You got to go to what actually causes these problems. And I believe what I'll be able to demonstrate today is that the guns are almost a non-issue in terms of the number of guns or whatever. The fact that they exist, you can make that argument, but I don't have a time machine. So maybe if somebody else does. But the issue is the root of almost every part of our gun culture, the root of the problems, all has to do with socioeconomic inequality, lack of universal health care, lack of glorification of the military, and this constant warfare we're under, the war on drugs, which causes mass incarceration and causes tons of violence in the inner city and usually in the more impoverished areas, because that's what they have to, many people end up resorting to, selling drugs and things like that in order to make money because there's no other opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that those are the root causes of all the violence, the gun violence, the suicides and everything else. And I think that the media narrative about guns is wholly incorrect and inaccurate if you really break it down. And they use biased studies and research and things like that. And we'll get into all that hopefully during this exchange. But my position is that gun ownership is a right, and it should be, because we live in a country that is not, like, our government doesn't do a good job of taking care of the people, of representing us in our interests. And in a country that has this kind of violence and this kind of, all these other issues that go along with it, asking people to give up their guns when they're not part of that problem, just the fact that they have guns, I think is a foolish way to go about it.
Well, thank you, Steve. And again, you've been on the Vanguard a couple of times, and we've had really great conversations. So thanks again for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem.
And Mr. Ben Burgis, you have not been a guest on our show yet, but Zach and I are both big fans of your work, and we're really pleased to be joined by you today. Would you briefly introduce yourself and just kind of give a brief summary of your position on the subject matter?
Sure. So I'm a columnist for Jacobin and the host of a show called Give Them an Argument. I guess it's getting close enough to the publication date. I should really plug here the new book, which is Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, Critique of the Contemporary Left. As far as my position on this, I'm glad to hear you guys saying in the introduction that you weren't looking for fireworks, because I certainly am not going to be able to provide you with any on this topic, right? There are lots of topics I would be happy to do a little firework setting off on. But this isn't particularly one of them, because I think I'm somewhat conflicted about big parts of the issue. I kind of think that given this particular issue, being a little conflicted is the right position. I'm not. I agree with much of what Steve says about root causes of certain kinds of gun violence. At the very least, we can argue about how much it causes different kinds of gun violence, but every single thing that he mentioned, is something that I think deserves our attention. And I'm also wary of emphasizing this issue for two reasons. One of them is that I think it tends to tie into culture war dynamics that aren't always helpful for the kind of politics that I'd like to promote. Which focus on assembling broad majority coalitions, around particularly issues of economic justice, equality for everybody, and these kinds of culture war issues tend to cut right down the middle of those potential coalitions. So I think there might be good reasons not to make it, a priority. I also think that while I do think, this is where we disagree, that there is good to be done, by restricting the number of guns in private circulation, that has to be balanced against very real concerns about civil liberties, about further fueling mass incarceration, and so that we need, if we do move towards stricter gun laws, I think we'd have to be extremely careful about how we do it. Okay, so that said, why do I disagree with Steve, right? Like, given everything I just said, right, why aren't we just going to sit here and agree with each other? Yeah, right. Okay, well, here are a couple reasons why.
Yeah.
So one of them is that I think that the analogy with medicine being invoked when you talk about symptoms is one that deserves to be looked at a little bit more closely. An awful lot of medicine is and should be about addressing symptoms. If you are in the hospital with a severe case of COVID, that ventilator does absolutely nothing to make it so that you don't have COVID. Instead, what it does is give you a chance to not be killed by COVID while, it gives you a chance not to be killed by the symptoms of COVID, while you get over the disease. And so I think similarly, we can acknowledge that gun violence often has lots of roots that aren't about guns, but also that we would be better off in various respects if we didn't have as many guns or guns of as deadly a kind in private circulation. We made it harder to have access to certain kinds of them, which was not my position for years and years. My position was that I thought that it was probably, we should probably be very wary of any attempt to cut back on private gun ownership for some of the same reasons that people who are guaranteed to show up in the chats section on things like this, who agree with me about other issues, will say, right? It's like, oh, wow, some kind of, radical leftist, you only want cops to have guns, huh? And I still see the force of that position, but I disagree for a few reasons. So I think that one, ultimately, I think as a long-term goal, it would be very good to be like one of the countries where even cops are not routinely armed, beat cops, for just regular patrols, and there are various places in the world where that's the case, but I think you can only get to that if you have many, many fewer guns in private circulation. And I'm also concerned about the effect of having regular mass shootings on the kind of society that you're going to end up living in if they happen a lot. And so I think that restricting the flow of guns might be the least bad realistic way out of that problem. And I also just don't think, and I suspect this is where I'm going to get my biggest disagreements with Steve, I just don't think it makes sense to say that there's a general right to gun ownership. We could argue about the pragmatics of it, and on the pragmatics of it, we'll probably agree on some and disagree with others, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that it makes sense to say that people have a right to do.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Sounds like both really, well thought on this issue. And again, that's why we brought you both on to give your cases. I guess the best place to start with this and the best question to ask is just in relation to the recent shootings, which have swept the nation, of course, in Boulder and near Atlanta, recently also in Virginia. I guess I'll start with Steve and just ask you, Steve, what is your message to those out there saying that it is the lack of gun reform which directly leads to and enables these kind of events?
Well, I mean, obviously, I disagree with that. It's not really bared out by the statistics. Can you pull up the graph that shows like different countries around the world and the gun ownership rates and gun homicide rates? It's like white. Yeah. So I had a realization about this, almost a decade ago, because this article came out in 2012 and it was in The Guardian, and it included an Excel file that you could download that showed the rates of gun ownership per country, like worldwide, and the rates of gun homicides per country worldwide. And, the Bloomberg anti-gun lobby, Everytown, they like to talk about the rich countries. So they talk about, us compared to Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. But science can't be done that way, like not well. If you're going to eliminate, you're cherry picking, a bunch of countries here. If you look at all the countries in the world, you literally get 100% correlation. 100% correlation between the socioeconomic inequality and social safety nets and things like that available in those countries, poverty, etc. So no, it was a graph. It was an actual graph. It was pretty. I sent it a couple days ago. It's earlier, but so the there's 100% correlation. So there's not 100% correlation between rates of gun ownership and gun homicides. That's lead crime. If you go down farther, up. Did I send it to you, right? Here, I'm going to message it to you right now, just so it can get put up. So, because I think it's important, and we have to look at the actual real numbers here. And this was as of 2012, so the numbers are actually more skewed now because the U.S. has had so many gun purchases since then. Like, we've gun ownership has skyrocketed. So I just sent it to you. So, for example, on this graph, you'll see that France and England, it's England/Wales. France has almost 5 times the gun ownership rate as the United States. There you go. France has almost 5 times the gun ownership rate as England does, but they have almost identical gun homicide rates. If you look, France is 0.06 and England is 0.07. So France is actually a little bit lower than England's, even though they have 5 times the number of firearms there, right? But if you look at all the countries, every single, I'm telling you, if you go through the whole list on the article, it's from The Guardian in 2012. Just look up, if you want to Google, look up The Guardian, look up, worldwide gun ownership, by country and gun homicide by country. Every single country that has more gun homicides, that has a higher rate of gun homicide than the United States, has worse socioeconomic inequality, worse poverty, worse health outcomes, worse healthcare systems, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of them do. And 100% of the countries that have better, rates of gun homicide than the United States have better socioeconomic equality, better social safety nets. They have universal health care, right? That's a 100% correlation. And you can look at the graph and you can see that there is not an actual correlation between number of guns and number of gun homicides. So and the other big thing is that when you're talking about mass shootings specifically, which is what this question is about, we have, there is an article that I sent you that shows that is a study that shows that mass shootings in counties where mass shootings, or counties with worsening inequality, mass shootings are more likely. It's not it. But it was one I sent you a couple days ago also. But it was an actual study from, I think it was Northeastern University, and they figured out that like counties with worsening inequality are significantly more likely to have mass shootings in those counties. And if your goal is to go kill somebody or kill a bunch of people, the idea that somebody like that is going to be like, but one line I'm not going to cross, that's not it either. The one line I'm not going to cross is I'm not going to get a gun illegally. I'm not going to, steal one or take it from, or build one illegally or do whatever. I'm not going to do that because that would just be a step too far. Like people who are going to murder a bunch of people don't care, right? The law is inconsequential as far as they're concerned. So what you end up doing if you start trying to restrict this gun ownership is you're restricting the people who aren't dangerous, who aren't a problem, who aren't going to be out there trying to shoot anybody. And if you break down the actual real data for the number of gun owners there are, because there's at least 100 million gun owners in the United States, and you're talking about 38,000 gun deaths every year. That includes almost 2/3 or about 2/3 that are suicide. So including suicides, if you wanted to come up with and assuming that the gun owners who kill somebody kill only one person, they kill either themselves or they kill somebody else, right? Which is not the case, but let's assume that just to make the numbers more stark. At that rate, in order to get to 1% of gun owners having killed somebody, either themselves or somebody else, it would take over 26 years at 38,000 people a year to get to 1% of gun owners having killed somebody. And if you do it just on homicides, which I think is a more honest way of presenting the argument, if you do it just on homicides, about 13,000 at the current rate, it would take over 78 years for 1% of gun owners to have killed somebody. So I think that's a big deal. And so when we're talking about gun reform, most of the time they talk about the things that are spectacular. They say, oh, these rifles, and then they hold them up and they're like, oh, look at these evil rifles, right? But you can pull this one up. I sent you this one today. Showed that mass shootings are more likely to be caused by, or the weapon of choice for mass shootings is handguns, right? So that was a study that was done, and they figured out that that's actually the primary weapon of choice. It's handguns, and that makes sense because they're easy to conceal. You can carry them around, no problem. And then there's also this. I'm going to message it to you now because I don't remember if I did.
Although I will say, Steve, we are on a time crunch for an hour question, so if we can circle back.
5 minutes, right?
Yeah. How much are you at?
No, I just wanted to send you this too. And the other big thing is this one here. Pull up this chart. This is from the FBI. Rifles. Okay, that includes assault rifles, AR-15s, AK-47s, et cetera, et cetera. But rifles account for fewer deaths, fewer murders every year. I just sent you a graph. I sent you a thing in Twitter DM. The last one I just sent you. Fewer people are killed using rifles in general, murdered with rifles, than are killed even by using no weapon whatsoever, using just your hands and feet. That's according to FBI data. So we're talking about, solving a problem that's like the least of the importance of the problem. And that's assuming you could even ban them and make them go away. It's not like they're biodegradable or anything like that, So you can see on there, personal weapons, hands and feet. In 2019, that was 600 people who were killed that way, and rifles, 364, right? So, I mean, we can't ban karate or whatever, however these people are killed, and nor would we, but the reality is that any of these sort of overarching gun control measures are going to, as Ben pointed out, have problems when it comes to your social freedoms, your social liberties, the ability to your civil liberties, your ability to do what you want in your life, And so I'm not somebody who sits around and talks about like we need this kind of gun or whatever. My point is we need to have a very real reason to allow a government that does so little for any of us to actually try and take away our rights on top of doing so little for any of us. That's mainly my take. Most of and one other thing is one thing that they talk about is
you are at 5 minutes now, so we'd like to.
Yeah. No, I'll get to this later. So that's
okay.
Good.
Great. Thanks for your answer though. And Ben, similarly, you can respond to anything that Steve brought up, and generally just respond to the question of these shootings as of late. Obviously, renewed focus and attention on this issue with mass shootings in Boulder and Atlanta and elsewhere. Do you believe that it was a lack of gun reform and restriction which directly enabled these mass shooting events?
I think in a sense, yeah. So I guess we should start out by talking about mass shootings and then go to the broader issues that Steve was raising. So as far as mass shootings go, there's a sense in which I don't think that you can just say, well, it's the availability of guns that led to it, because at least in some cases, people might, carry out or try to carry out, similar crimes, with, by other means, right? That certainly happens sometimes. I do think that in terms of the psychology of mass shootings, I don't know how realistic it is to think, for example, that you're going to get as many people sort of just planting bombs, for example, as doing it with guns. I think that it's quite likely that in a lot of cases, the statement that people want to make, the way that they want to express themselves, the blaze of glory they want to go out in, is much better expressed, by guns. And certainly, if you look, at a place like Australia, where fairly strict, gun control, was enacted after a high-profile mass shooting there, I don't think we've seen a big, uptick of like people bombing their schools instead of shooting them up, for example. And much less people doing it with knives, which is what people will sometimes bring up, that despite the effectiveness of gun control in lowering the rate of gun crimes in the UK, for example, that they have much higher rates of knife attacks. But of course, if we're specifically talking about mass shooting type events, then I would vastly rather somebody try to do that with a knife or with karate, than with a gun, because it will be way harder for them to rack up the same kind of kill count in the same amount of time. And I think mass shootings are certainly one of the areas where it's most plausible to think that the changing the availability of guns is going to be directly relevant. Because it's certainly the case, whatever you think about gun crime in general and the different ways of chopping up the relevant stats on that, when you get to mass shootings, especially if you stop looking at the misleading thing that people often point to, which is number of people per capita who are killed by mass shootings, and start looking at, which is going to be very similar in different countries. Anytime that you have, the number of people that's gathered in a big school or shopping mall, might be very similar, for countries with widely different populations overall, and start looking at the more honest thing, which is the actual number of incidents of mass shootings by country, then it seems very plausible that we would have dramatically fewer with stricter gun laws. And in particular, one point that Steve made, that I wanted to address was this question about, okay, somebody who's willing to carry out a mass shooting, they're not going to scruple at violating gun laws. But I think that argument goes a little too quickly. I think it misses something important. So there was a good article about this in 2017 in Current Affairs magazine by Nathan J. Robinson. I sent this to you guys in private chat if you want to show people, which is sort of cheekily entitled "What Gun Advocates Don't Understand About Economics," because of course so many people who are Second Amendment enthusiasts are not people with the good views that Steve seems to have about a lot of these other topics, but people who are like right wingers who are very fond of the "don't understand economics" charge, and Nathan's turning that around here. But what he's pointing to here is that what stricter laws regulating something do isn't completely stamp it out. Black markets exist, but that also doesn't mean that it doesn't change the availability or that fewer people who intend to commit crimes will have access to it. It absolutely does mean those things. Because what it does is it raises the opportunity cost. You have to try harder to find a gun if it's illegal, which, by the way, is a point that I think is oftentimes, like, even with things like arguments about drug prohibition, where I'm, like Steve, I think, very firmly opposed. I think people on our side need to acknowledge this, that sometimes we talk as if it's exactly as easy to get any drug, whether or not it's illegal. And of course, that's just not true. It's not, right? Some people who are particularly dedicated are going to be able to track things down in ways that other people who are less dedicated will not. And oftentimes, and I think that the comparative rates of incidents of mass shooting by country do speak to this point. Oftentimes, somebody who might be contemplating such a thing, when they sort of have something in mind, oh, I can get access to, my uncle's gun and I can go do this, might not. I think the number of people who have at some point the thought crosses their mind in high school, of shooting the place up, and the number of people who actually do it, there's a big gap. And one of the things that makes a difference in that gap is opportunistic access. And by the way, on the more general point about gun homicides, I think that comparing France and the UK just by the number of guns is a bit misleading. It's certainly, in both cases, dramatically lower than the United States, but also the gun laws, in both countries are fairly strict. So in France, for example, you get it's not no civilian may carry any weapons in a public place in France. A special form allows civilian to apply to carry a 1-year license, which allows them to carry a handgun and a maximum of 50 rounds if they are, quote, exposed to exceptional risk to their life. In practice, such authorizations are extremely rare. So I think what you're actually doing there is comparing two countries that both have a lot of the good social democratic stuff that we both like, that addresses some of the economic issues to a point, but also both have pretty strict gun laws. So I think within that, just looking at the comparing the gap between the, in both cases, pretty low rate of gun crimes doesn't tell us much. I'd also be very curious if there. Oh, okay. So I guess I'm going up to my limits of my time. Let me just say this last thing before we throw to Steve. Right. So. What I'd also be very curious about is, I suspect that this isn't available, because it probably doesn't exist, but I'm open to being corrected on that, is a one-to-one comparison on wealthy countries with lots of that good social democratic stuff in both cases, but very different rates of gun laws, of gun ownership, general laxity, about gun laws. And I suspect that in that case, you might start to see a difference. But even if you don't, right, that would just tell you that having lots of guns around might be a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one for having tons of gun crime.
Yeah. Can I just jump in for 2 quick points?
Sure thing.
One is currently in Australia, there are over 400,000 more guns today in private hands than there were before the Port Arthur massacre in 1996, which is when they had their gun buyback, which I sent you a link for that, Gavin, on the Twitter DM. So the gun ownership rate is actually higher there now than it was before Port Arthur. The difference is they had that one mass shooting, which statistically isn't like one thing happening is not a statistical thing that you can really rely on. They just have a better society there. They have a minimum wage of like $19.50 an hour. They have universal health care. They have, a lot more stuff figured out. And they also have a lower population density overall by quite a bit, which I think makes a difference as well. And then secondarily, Brazil, which on that list, if you want to pull that one graph back up from The Guardian, if you look at Brazil's gun homicide rate, it's something like 6 times higher than ours. And they have even stricter gun laws than France does. You have to buy a permit for each gun you own. You're not allowed to carry them at all outside of. There's no reason. Nobody is allowed to carry guns outside of their houses. And their police can actually shoot you on sight if they see you with a gun in public. They can just shoot you, and that's it. Right. So that's Brazil, and Brazil has 6 times the gun homicide rate than we do. So, and with almost 1/11 or so of the gun ownership rate, which at the time, was pretty high. But I would bet now we're way over 100, on that. Like we're more than 1-to-1 on guns to people in terms of that. But I think the right way to look at that is gun owners, not guns anyway. And it's hard to find stuff broken down that way because it's obviously the people that shoot somebody.
Well, I think that feeds into our next question quite well, actually, which we had tasked for you, Steve. The New York Post recently published an article calling for the ban on weapons of war. They say, quote, in fact, the Boulder gun was an AR-15 style weapon with a pistol stock and a shorter barrel, less accurate but easier to conceal, and nothing that any civilian needs to own. Do you think civilians need to own AR-15 style weapons? And if not, should they be legally allowed to own them?
I don't think that need is the right way to go about any of this stuff. We don't need alcohol. We don't need cigarettes. We don't need weed, here in California. We don't need lots of stuff, right? There's stuff, if you're going to go based off what we need healthcare. Why hasn't the government fixed that shit, right? Sorry. But, talking about needs isn't the point in a discussion of liberty or freedom and your ability to have, you know, self-actuation, be able to make decisions in your own life. The question is about wants and what you're going to do with it, you know. So people don't need fast cars, you know, like are we going to ban Corvettes or whatever? Like, it's just, you know, and the other thing is AR-15s actually are really good home defense weapons. They're not that great at personal defense, like out in public, because they're hard to carry around and whatever. But in a home defense setting, an AR-15, a standard AR-15 fires a 223 or 5.56 millimeter NATO round. It's the smallest and least powerful center fire rifle round available. Like, it's the smallest one. It's the least powerful one. And if, you know, with like a 55 grain bullet or something like that, which is a very common type of bullet for those guns, it won't go through two pieces of drywall on opposite sides of a wall. It'll hit the first one, go through, fragment, and then kind of splatter into the second piece of drywall. So it's less likely to go through a wall than like a decent handgun, like a 357 Magnum or anything like that. You know, stuff that people commonly do have for home defense. You know, but it's also good for hunting, like boar hunting and things like that, where in areas of this country where wild boar are taking over, you know, ruining farmlands and all this other stuff, you need to be able to shoot something and multiple somethings while they're moving, you know, and all that sort of stuff. AR-15 is a great weapon for that. But I also think it's disingenuous to call it a weapon of war. If you understand, like I do, about these guns and how they're built and everything else, all the moving parts inside an AR-15 are different from the actual military weapons, M4s, M16s. They have different triggers, different hammers, different bolt carrier groups, different buffer tubes, different buffers. All the moving parts are different. So if we're going to say it's military style and those things are all different, then are we going to say what's the part that is actually the military style thing? Is it the barrel? Is it the pistol grip? You know, if it's the pistol grip, then we might have to ban some shotguns too, because there are pump action shotguns that have pistol grips. But and obviously ban pistols, because they all have pistol grips. But if it's the other stuff, if it's the magazine or anything else, can you pull up a picture of those two pictures in a row of that Ruger Mini 14? The Ruger Mini 14 takes the exact same magazine, the exact same ammunition, and looks like that. So that's not an assault rifle, apparently, but it does exactly the same thing. It shoots exactly the same round, carries the exact same magazines, like same magazines go into that, and it operates the same way in terms of, you know, how it recycles and everything else. And that's not on the list. And if you want to pull up the other picture that had the two rounds next to each other, the two bullet, there you go. The gun on top's an AR-15. It fires the bullet on the left. The gun on the bottom is an M1 or an M14, and it fires the bullet on the right, the casing on the right. Both of them are semi-automatic. Both of them can have high capacity magazines available for them. In fact, you can get a 100 round drum mag for either of those guns. And the one on the bottom will shoot like through a school. Like, I mean, it's a very powerful round. It'll go through all kinds of people, all kinds of walls. But nobody carries those in mass shootings, so everybody just thinks it's fine. But even if you could eliminate the AR-15 from ownership, which you can't, like that ship sailed a long time ago. But even if you could do it, all people would have to do is switch types of guns, and they would still be doing the exact same thing, you know. And but again, I get back to this point. I believe what's happening is the politicians make their dough, if you will, and their parties make their money trying to convince people to vote for them to win office, and doing, you know, operating from that perspective, they push for these lazy, sort of ineffective policy positions because they want to be able to use them as talking points and everything else. But they have no real interest in ending gun crime. If they wanted to end gun violence and they actually did the right things to end it, then they would no longer be able to campaign on ending gun violence. Like it's a self-defeating thing. So I really think that matters. And I think that we need to pay attention to what they're actually offering us and what they're saying that they're going to do, because they don't care. They really don't care about us. If they did, our government would operate a lot differently. So I think that just as a general point, people should be a lot more skeptical of what these politicians and their sort of lapdog media have to say about these sort of fixes.
Well, you're definitely not going to get any pushback on that point, Steve. And Ben, I was wondering if you would agree or disagree with Steve on his characterization of an AR-15 style weapon as not a weapon of war. And generally, would you agree that civilians need to own those kind of weapons?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm not crazy about that framing, because the suggestion is always that it's the implication is that it's always totally fine if they're being used to kill darker skinned people in America's, endless and pointless and bloody and destructive wars overseas, which I actually have an even bigger problem with, than I do with America's gun laws. So I don't, I don't like that framing at all. Do civilians need to own them, right? Oh yeah, no, we should have be manufacturing all the AR-15s, we need for our imperial military, but not civilians. I think but putting aside the framing, right? The quest. So there are two questions, that have been raised here. One of them is whether it would do any good to ban AR-15s, and if so, what that ban would look like. And you certainly wouldn't want it to be like the assault weapons ban that we used to have, which was like made determinations between different kinds of guns that were largely aesthetic, had absolutely nothing to do with how many people you could kill, how quickly with them. But, they're literally, my understanding is that there are cases where the exact same gun, like with a bayonet on it, counted as an assault rifle, and one without one, didn't. Yeah. So you can shoot just as many people, but you can't use it to open a can, so that's not a, assault rifle. That clearly that doesn't do anybody any good. Right. So the other question is do people have a right to own guns, or to own guns of particular kinds? If we're contemplating, banning, certain kinds of guns, one hopes in a better designed way, than those past examples. And that's where Steve started. He said that if we're talking about rights, it's not a question of need. We don't ask, or shouldn't ask, whether people have a right to drink alcohol or smoke weed or whatever. Instead, we don't ask whether people need to do those. Instead, we should ask whether they have a right to do them, which I agree with, right? So let's ask that question about owning deadly weapons with which you can kill lots of people very quickly. And I would say no, that's not the kind of thing that you can have a right to. Because one of the reasons that we, if I were explaining to somebody who, advocated going back to prohibition, why I have a right to drink whiskey. If I was going to explain to someone who advocated the current prohibition of weed that's on its last legs right now in the United States, why people have a right to smoke weed, I would emphasize that the only harm that's potentially being done by these things used in excess is to yourself. You might have needs that if, there might be indirect ways that could affect other people. I don't think that those are good enough, right? To intrude as far as we need to intrude into the private sphere to legally stop people from drinking or smoking weed. But by and large, the main effects are only to yourself. Whereas with guns, that's just definitionally not right. That they have it's not the case that the only harms that are being done by guns are to yourself. Now, of course, a lot of the harms that are being done by guns are to yourself. My understanding, last stats I saw, is that there are over twice as many people who die from gun accidents, as from, arguably justifiable uses in self-defense. So very often, the harm is being done to you. Although with most gun accidents, very often times the harm is being done to third parties there. Like children, other people in the house. But the purpose, right, is to do harm to others, and I think that with anything where that is the purpose, that's the intrinsic function of it, then I just don't think that the analogy with booze or weed holds up. I think other people innately have more of a say about what sorts of weapons, forget war, right? Just weapons of violence. You have a right to. So if you say, hey, I need a AR-15 so I can shoot wild boars on my farm. Okay, fair enough. That's a legitimate reason, right? And that has to be balanced in designing gun regulations against all of the people who would rather who would rather not take the risk of living in an environment where there are lots of weapons of these around, and certainly might not want the secondary bad consequences of it, besides accidents, increased ease of gun homicide, which, by the way, I'd agree that the Brazil example shows you that if the economic conditions are bad enough, then gun restriction is likely to be ineffective. I would argue that there are other countries that show that the combination of better economic conditions and gun restrictions is pretty good. And for reasons I mentioned earlier, I'm skeptical. I think it's at the very least not yet established in this conversation that the combination of better economic conditions and extremely lax gun laws, to the extent that we have in the United States, would have better results than that. But last point I just wanted to make, here, because I think it's an important one, it hasn't been addressed yet, is about what the realistic alternative is. Like, so if mass shootings,
we are at about 5 minutes, Ben. If I'd like to move on to a next question, if that's okay, unless you want to make it really quick point.
No, I'll make it snappy. Because I think that if you have regular high-profile mass shootings and you never get around to gun control, then you're increasingly going to have other remedies, and those other remedies are going to make us a less free, more militaristic society. Look at even suburban schools that increasingly start to look like prisons with metal detectors and armed guards. Because if you aren't restricting the flow of guns, then the only alternative is to either live with it, which is probably not realistic, as an ask, or to have harden the targets. And so we spend all of our lives being shuffled from one hard target to another, constantly supervised by armed guards. And that doesn't sound like a society I'd like to live in.
Absolutely. Well, you brought up the kind of inherent right to own a gun. And of course, that reminds us of the Second Amendment, which is why we have that right, guaranteed as Americans, at least as of now and as of since the founding of this country. But Steve, I was wondering if you could answer a question that I've heard brought up by many people on the other side of your position. And that's kind of going to the wording of the Second Amendment itself. It's very vague, and because it was written in a pre-AR-15 or machine gun or whatever, advanced gun era, nowadays the language could be interpreted to defend the ownership of pretty much any weapon, including missile launchers or grenades or even bombs. Technically, all weapons are arms. So I was just wondering where you would draw the line, if at all, on what is available for citizens to own.
Yeah, I can draw that line pretty good. I think it's drawn pretty well where it is. The idea was to allow people to carry an arm that is basically a one-to-one weapon. Like, you shoot it, you kill a person if you hit them, or whatever. So it's one person to one person. It's not a grenade you're going to throw and like blow up a bunch of people. They didn't advocate for private cannon ownership back in those days. It was about individual rights with individual arms for their own protection, and for the protection of the country, because they saw it at that time. They had just overthrown a monarchy that essentially had the redcoats were essentially armed police in the streets who were enforcing curfews and doing all kinds of stuff that, hey, guess what? It's back, and they had, the founders wanted the people of this country to always be allowed or able to defend themselves against such tyranny as they saw it. And it's not actually vague. None of the Bill of Rights is actually vague. If you look at all 9 of the amendments, because the 10th Amendment is just like whatever we didn't say here, you can, is up to the states to decide. But the first 9, all of them empower the individual and sort of disempower, or however you want to put that. I don't even know if that's a word, but disempower the government against the individual. All of them do that. The First Amendment guarantees the rights of individuals to speak their mind, to freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, etc. Second Amendment, what that's doing right there, they're in Article 1, Section 8 of the body of the Constitution, Clause 16. And that's the powers of Congress, is that area of the Constitution. It says to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such parts of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. That's powers of Congress inside the thing. So the Second Amendment, if you want to pull that back up, what it's actually saying is it's drawing a contrast between the militia. It's calling back to the militia in Article 1, Section 8, saying, hey, that militia we talked about here, a well-regulated militia is necessary for the security of a free state, right? So they're saying that thing up there that was already in here, because remember, an amendment amends the document, right? So they're saying, yeah, we agree about this thing, that the militias are necessary, but the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. If they meant it was just for the militia, they would have said the right of the militia. They changed the wording because they were saying that the people themselves need to be allowed to own guns as a defense primarily against overreaching government. Like that was really the point. And if you look at it from their perspective of overreaching government, that means that that civilians have to have somewhat equivalent firearms, because back then civilians and the government both had muskets. It was the same, right? So they're saying that we need to have the same for the people need to be able to defend themselves against the government, against government tyranny. So I think that it's not that vague, and I think that there's been a lot of effort made in the media and in past Supreme Court decisions and things like that to try and sort of turn it into this vagary. But if you really look at, and this is my wheelhouse, by the way, my whole wheelhouse is like the root of my knowledge base of the United States is that U.S. history is my number one subject. I love it. And those guys, most of them were actual leftists, even by today's standards. Even the awful, slave owners and things like that. So I just really think that we need to think this through and look at it really from their perspective, if you're going to understand it. And all of them advocated. I mean, I think it's Federalist 19. I'm guessing. I'm not 100% on that, but I think it was Federalist 18, 19. The Alexander Hamilton writing as Publius. He advocated also for the private ownership of firearms, and basically said that you needed to, that he would expect that people would train with them at least twice a year to make sure they maintain their proficiency at it. But they were very clear about it, and the truth is if you look at the country as a whole, very few people with those guns hurt anybody. And beyond that, we don't even know how many guns there are. We know that there's at least 400 million of them. But one thing that people don't bring up enough is there's a thing called an 80% lower receiver. You can buy these legally. You can buy jigs and things for them, and you can actually make your lower receiver for an AR style weapon. Now, if you do that,
time, Steve.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well,
and
home manufacturing is a real thing, and I've seen I guarantee you there are tens of millions of those out there too. Government has no idea.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. And Ben, I do want to get your response to that specifically. And as we approach our time limit, I wanted to get one last question in here for you guys as well. So I'll go ahead and Ben, I want to get your reply. And after I do, we can get both of you guys to answer this question, because I think it's an important one that maybe doesn't get discussed enough. And I wanted to ask if it is possible to have effective gun policy that is administered primarily, if not exclusively, at the state level. Oftentimes, when gun regulation is passed, it's argued that our national gun policy is ineffective in a city like Chicago. But people will argue that, next door in Indiana, they have much more relaxed gun control policy, so that it's inconsistent. There's a lot of people traveling state by state to go to a place where it's easier to acquire a gun. There's a lot of arguments about that. And I'm wondering if you could each provide your position on whether or not this is something that's possible to be handled at the state level, or if it requires broad stroke federal action.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think it's possible to handle it on the state level. I think you just said, why not? Obviously nothing that Chicago does on a municipal level or that Illinois does on a state level is going to be relevant to what happens in Chicago, which is a city that literally borders a state that has, depending on what, where you live in Chicago, it could be a 15-minute drive where they have much laxer, gun laws. And obviously you're not going to be confronted with border checks between states, nor should you be. So that's an easy answer. No, I don't think it's possible to do it effectively on a state level. I'm not sure if Steve will even disagree. I think he just argued you also can't do it effectively on a national level.
No, I do disagree, and I could go into details.
Okay,
all right. I'll wait till you're done.
That's interesting, because I thought you'd been arguing previously in the discussion that there's nothing we can do on a national level to significantly lower ownership rates of these.
No, that is correct. I'm saying that
there's nothing we can do on a national level to do that. There's certainly nothing we can do on a state level.
Yeah.
I don't see, I don't see any way around that. But yeah, look, on the Second Amendment issue, I think that So two things. One, I wouldn't place too much importance on this for a few reasons. I think that I'm not too enamored in general with originalism about trying to figure out sort of decode the thoughts in the heads of the framers of the Constitution. And of course, if Steve is right about this, and I'm right about the more general issue, then it sounds like we should amend, the Second Amendment rather than, but it just pushes back the question, right? So, but that said, I think that what he just said actually amounted to to an explanation, maybe despite his intentions, of why there is a lot of vagueness there, because the two things that he said in explanation of the alleged lack of vagueness, of the alleged precision of the Second Amendment, were one, that the intention of the Second Amendment was along with the intention of the rest of the Bill of Rights, is to protect individuals against the government, and two, that the specific way that it was doing that was by parity between how well armed citizens are and how well armed the government is. But of course, if that's the point, that seems flatly incompatible with where Steve said the line should be drawn. That okay, handguns okay, weapons grade uranium not okay. Where do we make the distinction? And he said that the distinction is at the question of how many people you're killing with one pull of a trigger. That one person kills one person as they're doing that. So grenades, for example, would not be okay. But wait a second, if we shouldn't have civilian ownership of grenades, then I'm trying to figure out whether that means that the U.S. military shouldn't have grenades, or whether, in fact, we're abandoning the principle that he just told us is implicit in the Second Amendment, which is that you need this parity in terms of how well armed citizens are and how well armed the government.
Well, can I respond to that? If we're talking about but I mean, shit on this path, when we end up in a fight against the government, like an actual fight, which obviously I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but I'm a student of history, like I said. At the point that that's actually a thing, that there's actually open revolt, and people are fighting, like they're going to get their hands on grenades and whatever else they can get their hands on anyway. So that's not a question of whether or not it should be legal. I don't think that even matters at that point, but that would only matter under those circumstances. Whereas having the population owning so many guns, I think at least, I mean, in an ideal world, would keep the government in check. And that's the point and I really do believe it. You know, this is a falsely attributed quote to some of the founders and stuff, but I really do believe that the government should fear its people and not the other way around. I don't think the people should fear their government, but I do believe that the government should fear its people. And, you know, I think it's fairly obvious that they don't. And I think that's why we end up in the situation we're in. I look at it like, if you look at a boardroom, if you think about the oligarchy that runs our country and most of the world, as a boardroom, if you walk in there just as a regular guy with nothing and you're like, can I please have some health care? Everybody, please. Oh, it'd be so nice. My family needs health care. They would laugh you out. They'd call security. You'd be gone, right? But if you walk in with a rifle, I think they listen. You know, I think it's really kind of that simple. You need to have leverage of some sort. And it's unfortunate. The unfortunate part is that right-wing people typically are the ones that own the most guns, and they tend not to care about or seem not to care about all the other rights that they violate, or, you know, that our government violates every single day. They only care about the Second Amendment, you know, which is weird. But I care about all of them, you know, and Ben is a philosophy guy. The big thing is, and one thing that Gavin said earlier, you talked about like where we get this right to bear arms is from the Constitution. No, rights that are really rights aren't granted by a government or anything like that. It's a right that you just have as a human being, by birth. There's no border that makes those rights disappear, which means that every time we bomb innocent people in another country, we violate their rights just as much as we violate anybody's here. You know, rights are inherent and universal. And the right to defend yourself against people who would want to harm you, no matter who those people are, I believe is also a right that's inherent and universal. It's not the Bill of Rights was just there to prevent in theory, to prevent the government from violating those rights. It wasn't to grant them to us.
Well, I think that's a great place to go ahead and wrap. If you guys are either interested in a final comment for that.
I got one, but I'll let Ben go first too.
Sure.
Sure. So I agree with what Steve says about inherent universal rights. I don't think gun ownership is plausibly on that list. Not getting bombed by foreign military. Yeah, on that list. You can, you know, eat what you want, drink what you want, smoke what you want. Yeah, that's on that list. That you have access to weapons that make it easy to kill lots of other people very quickly, I don't think is plausibly on that list of innate, you know, universal rights. Never mind, you know, rights that we have, or even, you know, rights. You know, not all rights are innate and universal. Some are, some aren't. We could have a much longer discussion about that. But because I know we are wrapping up, the last thing I wanted to say is, like, Steve spent a lot of time talking about the cynical motivations of politicians on the anti-gun side who want to use this as a culture war kind of wedge issue, get out the vote, etc. And that's not wrong, but it's also not relevant to the question of who's right about what gun laws we should have. And one way of seeing why it's not relevant is that you could equally say an equally cynical and equally true thing about the culture war motivations of pro-gun rights politicians, you know, the ones who are currently calling the shots, who clearly use it as a wedge issue to try to get out the vote, etc. So once we put aside the whole question of bad motivations, because there are plenty of those all around, and ask a different question, which is what are the best gun laws that we can have in order to achieve the pragmatic things that we want, like having less gun violence, certainly less mass shootings, not having people resort to the other things they'll likely resort to in the absence of gun laws. Then I think that's a much better place to start the conversation than reject what people are saying because they have bad motive.
So is it my turn?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so on that point, I think that's correct. But I'm just trying to point out, I don't believe that the gun laws actually would be effective in any way. I think in a country with 400 million guns, and who knows how many millions of those are AR-15 style rifles, because in like 46, I think, of the states in the country, they don't even require you to like record your name, write down your name if you buy a long gun, which is a shotgun or a rifle, and that includes assault rifle. So the government has no idea even where they are, even if they exist, and that doesn't even bring into account the 80% lowers and all this other stuff. I don't think that those gun laws would actually reduce the number no matter what. But I also think that there's a little bit of just, it's almost a meanness about it, because what they're really saying is in terms of suicide, because that's most gun deaths, right? But in terms of suicides, the government's really saying, look, we know you're having a lot of stress and you might want to kill yourself. But even though we don't want to help end your suffering through means at our disposal, which we could do if we really wanted to, we just won't. We want to take away your means of ending your own suffering by taking away your guns or whatever like that. Like, that's a meanness. And if you talk about homicide, it's the same thing. It's like, look, we know that the overwhelming majority of gun owners are peaceful, that don't ever shoot anybody. We know that the most gun homicides are committed in the commission of a felony or through gangs or things like this. But not only are we going to do nothing to protect you and your family from these things, we want to take the guns away from you so that you won't be able to protect yourself or your family either. I think if we set up a system where I think in a truly just and fair society, which I know is an unachievable thing, but I mean, in this imaginary world where we could have a really, truly just and fair society, you could have a loaded AR-15 leaning up against a pole on every street corner. And the only time anybody would ever get shot is by accident, because the motivation to shoot somebody isn't there. And that's the point, and you can't ask to take people's guns away from them when they're living in such a dangerous society. It's backward. If you made the society less dangerous by virtue of solving these socioeconomic issues and everything else that go along with it, then you might have a case to make in banning the guns. But at that point, I suspect you wouldn't care. You wouldn't really mind it, right? You wouldn't care about the guns.
Well, I think we've had really what I was hoping to get through with the discussion today, and Gavin and I thank both Ben and Steve for participating. This is definitely the kind of conversation that could go on for much longer. We only had an hour booked for today. Perhaps in the future we can continue this discussion. It's certainly something that we'll be continuing to explore as a topic on the Vanguard. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to our two participants today. It was a very well-rounded, thoughtful discussion where we got to the bottom of, attempted to get to the bottom of some of these ideas. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, both of you. I think it was a really well-matched and illuminating conversation, both bringing up really interesting and nuanced points. And we'd love to have you both on and independently or together to continue this discussion. Again, thank you so much for your time. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Gavin.
Absolutely.
Have a good night, guys.
I did want to shout out our patrons real quick before we sign off for good. Again,
I
thanks
apologize
everyone.
that the sun has been in my face for the last 20 minutes. I was trying to fix it at the end, but I guess we're just going to have to live with it.
It's all good. But yeah, I really appreciate everyone that's been watching along. I thought this was a fantastic debate, a great discussion, again, between two friends of the show. Again, thanks so much to Ben and Steve. I put their information in the bottom of or in the description box. If you want to follow them on Twitter, check it out. Also check out, Steve's campaign for Congress. He's running as an independent in California, and Ben has his show on YouTube and is
Give them an argument.
Yeah, exactly. And also writes for Jacobin. So certainly check out both of these men. And like I said, hit the link in the description box if you wish to join our Patreon community. That's patreon.com/the Vanguard channel. For $10 a month, you can join us on a live stream like this one, and we can get in a little bit of a debate ourselves if you wish. So again, thanks so much for the support, guys. We'll be doing more of these debates coming up in the near future. We had a debate not long ago, and this has been our second on the channel. But we want this to be a recurring, maybe monthly feature of our show, and we've really been enjoying it so far, and think you guys will too, and we'll want to see some of the future topics that we broach. So again, smash that subscribe button, smash that notification button, hit that like button, and a super huge shout out to Steve Cox and Ben Burgis. We really enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, exactly. And like Gavin said, we'll be doing these about monthly. And we're trying to steer into the weeds, guys. We're trying to have the conversations that people don't want to have, right? I mean, there were 3 fucking mass shootings. And yeah, look around at how many people on BreadTube are trying to cover debates like this where we can have thoughtful conversations where nobody gets attacked. We all sit down. We all have an idea about our ideas respectfully. We exchange our thoughts and we grow and we have nuanced discussions. That's what we're about on the Vanguard. Because there's no reason that we can't discuss and debate and have, conversations that are lively and informative and, kind of lay out our differences. There's so much of a willingness to, create like caustic tension, but there's not a lot of willingness to engage on an ideas level. So, yeah, just thanks for these special thanks to Ben and Steve for joining us. And we'll continue to have these kinds of debates for you guys on the channel.
Yep. Everyone have a great rest of your Sunday and just, be well.
Yeah. Take